for them at the end. So Stacy, it's yours. You just need to unmute.
Okay. Can you see my screen, my PowerPoint?
Yep, I can see your screen.
Wonderful. Okay, so for today, we're going to talk about helping students with learning exceptionalities. We're going to talk about what an exceptionality is, some language around exceptionalities, some myth versus reality, some general tutoring strategies, as well as some online learning strategies and resources that we've come up with in this new COVID world that we've been dealing with for the last 2 years. We're going to talk a little bit about the school system, just so you have an understanding of what parents may be going through with their children that are in your programs, and then we'll do a little bit of wrap up. So an exceptionality refers to a type of learner that has been identified by an IPRC. The nice part about the education world, especially the special education world, it is alphabet soup. So we will talk a little bit about some of the acronyms later. So it'll all make sense in a little bit. A student who has been identified as having a communicational, behavior, intellectual, or physical exceptionality. And what we need to remember is there are some students, actually most students have multiple exceptionalities. So they don't just fall in one tunnel. It creates havoc in multiple areas of their lives. So while I was reading the Right to Read Commission Executive Summary, this quote stood out to me. It says, "Adequate special education is not a dispensable luxury. For those with severe learning disabilities, it is the ramp that provides access to the statutory commitment to education made to all children." So not everybody learns the same, and we need to make sure we pay special attention to those who have those different learning needs. So some of the languages around exceptionalities in the last 10, 15 years or so have changed. So before, you would hear someone refer to somebody as a speech impaired student or language impaired student, or you know, specifically ADHD, they may not even identify the student. Now what we try to do is make them a person first who lives with or has an exceptionality. So a student who has a speech impairment, or a student with a speech impairment, as opposed to a speech impaired student. It labels them as the exceptionality, not making them human first. Ultimately though, you want to go with a person's preferred self-identification. So you may have some, I know some, especially in the world of autism, some actually prefer to be referred to as autistic. Some do not. So it's kind of that figuring out what language is acceptable for the person that you're working with. So we're going to talk about some myths, because there is always those assumptions and myths that come with learning exceptionalities. First one is that people living with exceptionalities have lower intelligence. And the reality is people with exceptionalities actually have average to above average intelligence. It's the way they learn that is different. It is not the traditional way of learning. Their capacity and functioning is different, but they are often quite smart. People living with exceptionalities are lazy and unmotivated. So people living with exceptionalities actually have difficulty learning by conventional methods. So they need those special techniques and those different approaches. It's not necessarily laziness, it's usually frustration. They're so frustrated because they're being taught in a traditional manner and they don't understand it. And so they find little tricks and ways around doing their work because they're frustrated. And then they get bored, and then it becomes a behavior management in the classroom or in a program outside of the classroom. Learning disabilities are only academic problems. So in reality, they actually interfere with multiple areas of their life. At Frontier College here in Sudbury, we have a lot of our group programs, and a lot of the kids that come to our homework clubs, our reading circles, our math clubs, are kids who have some exceptionalities, but what they need most is help with the social aspect of their schooling life. So they come to socialize and learn how to socialize, as well as learn whatever it is that we're working on, whether it be math or reading or whatever. And then they also can affect things like teamwork, working at a job, all of that kind of stuff. And if they don't find strategies when they're younger, it snowballs as they get older. They may have a hard time keeping a job because they don't have the strategies in place that their exceptionality are affecting that part of their life. Number 4, all it takes to have a learning disability is one bad teacher. That is not the case. Learning disabilities are medical disorders. They can't be caused by somebody. The quality of instruction and intervention does play a very important role in their success, but it's not the teacher's fault that they have a certain exceptionality. Sometimes teachers may be more hesitant to do different things, maybe stuck in their ways, and they just need some extra help and learning to learn how to help a student in the best way that's possible. Exceptionalities are identified as a result of testing. While testing does play a factor, it is not the only thing that they do to identify exceptionalities. So for things like communication disorders, ADHD, dyslexia, all of that kind of stuff, they have observations, they do curriculum-based assessments, they do formal assessments, they do standard testing. They do a whole bunch of different things to look at different aspects of the child to make the correct diagnosis. So testing isn't the only piece. A lot of it is observational, especially with ADHD. It's mostly observational. So on my screen here is the cover for the guide that I wrote with a master's student back in 2015, so strategies for students with special education needs. And I'm just going to give you a quick preview of it. So here's the PDF itself. The link to the PDF is in the chat, as well as on the agenda for today's conference. So you will have access to that. So if you look at the table of contents, we go through quite a few different types of exceptionalities, and they're broken down. So we talk about communicational exceptionalities, behavioral, intellectual, as well as physical. This is not meant to be a be-all and end-all of each one of these exceptionalities. We did this guide with the intention that when you have a student that comes to a program, or maybe you're a parent whose child gets the diagnosis, you could go onto Dr. Google and go down that rabbit trail. We wanted to provide this guide so that you have a place to start. So each section, here on autism, each section has the disorder, as well as a little bit of information about it. So just some surface level information just to kind of get your feet wet, and then some strategies that may help with that student. Not every strategy is going to work for every student, but every strategy you try, especially if you're in a group setting, is going to work for somebody in that group. So the great part of working with students with exceptionalities is you're trying strategies that are hopefully going to help them, or that have proven to help them, but it's not just helping them, it's helping everybody else, or many others as well. So our guide goes through, like I said, it's a little bit of information, as well as a quick list of some strategies to start trying. And it's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you a starting place. So you don't get overwhelmed by the rabbit trail that can be Google. At the beginning, we do have a bit of an introduction. It kind of goes over how to use the guide and talks about special education needs and just learning strategies in general. So like I said, you have access to that PDF in the chat, as well as on your agenda. So some general tutoring strategies. When you're working with kids, especially in a group, anytime you're doing anything, whether it be work, an activity, getting ready to transition to something else, you want to explain what has to happen in specific steps. You want to give one instruction at a time and speak slowly. So if you've got a student if you tell them to do, say, get your shoes on, get your jacket on, get your hat on, and go line up. They're going to get their shoes on and they're going to go line up. They're going to forget the middle two because their brain can't hold that much information. So what you can do is either say, okay, everybody get your shoes on, everybody get your jacket on, everybody get your hat, and do it one at a time as everybody does it. Or you can just keep repeating it. Get your shoes on, hat, jacket, line up, and keep going. Shoes, hat, jacket, line up, so that they can figure out where they are in that sequence. But they're not required to keep all of that information in their head. Like I said, provide lots of repetition. Ensure you have their attention before giving instructions. So if they're not paying any attention, they're not listening. My middle little guy, he's not looking at you, you've said nothing. So making sure that you have that eye contact when you're working with a group, it's harder. But again, that repetition is going to help. So when they do, if you've got a couple that weren't paying attention, when they do start paying attention, they can kind of get into the groove within everybody else. Lots of positive feedback. Celebrating all the little things is always great. It gives them that boost and that self-confidence to keep doing whatever it is that they're doing. And if you're working with some text or anything else like that, or reading a story, summarizing some key points to help them kind of give them something to hang their hat on, especially if it's a longer story or a longer text. If you are doing any sort of activity-based thing, you want to make sure you're choosing materials that are clearly printed, no streaky photocopies. And you often see these handouts that are beautiful with all of these like extra pictures and fancy fonts and all of that kind of stuff. That is actually detrimental to a student who has certain learning exceptionalities. So you want to try and avoid that. It may look plain, but it's the best way for their brain to focus. Because if you've got all that other fancy stuff, they have all that stuff to get distracted by. Whereas if it's just plain and to the point, their brain can get to the point. Using visual aids, in some cases, works really well. In some cases, for some students, it actually does the complete opposite and distracts them. So it's, like I said before, you've got to find the strategies that work for the group that you're working with. Another one is try not to talk and write at the same time. You want to write something down and then explain it. So I often, when I do this workshop in person, what I'll often do is I'll have either a whiteboard behind me or a chart paper or something, and I'll turn around and write and talk. Because what happens is when you do that, you're turning around away from somebody. If they have a hearing issue, if they're hard of hearing, deaf or hard of hearing, they're reading your lips. They can't read your lips when all they see is the back of your head. So they're only getting what you write, but they're also not able to process what you're saying as well, because what you're writing isn't always exactly the same. So you want to make sure you do one thing at a time so that all of the students who are using different cues are able to get those cues. And having students repeat or rephrase material or instructions or whatever it is that you're working on with them to make sure they understand. So they understand what they're doing, and often when they repeat or rephrase things, you can see where the misconceptions are, or you can see what they may have missed that is causing them not to be successful in whatever it is that you're doing. This degrees of challenge chart actually came from a colleague of mine who covered my last mat leave. She did some teaching work in England, and this is where where it came from. But this is a great thing to have if you're working in a program, even just to have one on you that's laminated And you can kind of go around the room if you're noticing some students who are struggling, and they can just kind of point to where they're feeling on the degree of challenge. So they're either doing this work quickly, easily, and without having to stop and think. They can do it quickly, occasionally having to stop and think. They can do it well with sometimes having to stop and think. They understand what they need to do. They need some think time before and during the time that they're completing the work. They need to think a lot before starting and while completing the work. And then the black one, I need to think a lot before starting, and there are parts where I can't continue independently without further help. So instead of yelling across the room to somebody, what do you need help with? You can kind of see where they are on that chart with them pointing. So it's not singling anybody out. And you can do it to everybody, like go around and have them just kind of point. And if you get some reds, you keep on going. And when you get to the green, blue, and black, you know, kind of sit down with them and help them over whatever hurdle they're at. So with the COVID world, a lot of our programs in Sudbury have gone online. And now that we've had the online programming, I think we'll always have an aspect of it. So it is something that we do keep at the forefront, because we are still working with students on the computer. If you are working with students, whether it be a group or one-on-one, you want to choose resources that will hold their interest. I always tell my tutors, you know, you may have plan A, make sure you have plan B, C, D, and E on tabs on your screen, because you never know what's going to kind of flop, and then at least you can hop to something else instead of floundering. Trying to keep the same structure. So routine and structure, especially with some exceptionalities, that helps them kind of anchor their day. If you think of things like autism, where they often thrive on those routines, even with ADHD, students with ADHD, when they have anchors in their day, it's usually transition periods that they struggle with the most, because that's where they have more ability or more freedom to have those impulsive behaviors. So if they know exactly what's coming up and they know that routine, they often do much better with it, because they're doing the same thing over and over and over again. So that structure and routine is often very important to students with exceptionalities, but it also helps students who may not have any sort of exceptionality, just to know what's coming up in their day. So spacing things, so splitting up the learning. If you're doing, you know, a craft activity, and then you're going outside, and then you're doing maybe, you know, sitting outside. After you play at the park, you're going to sit outside and you're going to read a story or whatever it is. You want to kind of split things up, so that their brain isn't having to process a lot of information all at the same time. Providing regular feedback and use of retrieval practices, so quizzes and tests, or using that rephrase technique that I talked about earlier. Having teacher modeled problem solving throughout, so we work with tutors mostly, but even just with regular programming, when they see how someone deals with a situation, so anybody that was in Ben's workshop where we had that scenario, when they see how people deal with a situation, you're modeling for them how they should deal with similar situations. So whether it be through learning, activity, whatever it is, being that role model. You can ask them direct questions. If you're doing some, again, literacy work, you're focusing on vocabulary and defining things for them so that they can comprehend the text a little bit better. Don't make any assumptions on their knowledge. Like I said, many students who have an exceptionality have average or above average intelligence. So don't make assumptions on what they know. Every child is going to have different childhood experiences. So their background knowledge kind of cache in their brain is going to be different. A lot of kids, especially students with some different exceptionalities, need help with organization. I know in our programs, we spend a lot of time, especially with the older kids, on how to use their agenda properly, how to organize their stuff so that they're not losing everything. And spending time specifically on those skills is a life skill that they learn and walk away with. And giving them materials ahead of time is also helpful. Some really great resources if you're running any sort of group programming, teachertoolkit.co.uk. It is, like I said, a UK site. It is got some really, really great behavior management tips in there. The Ontario Government Learn at Home has a lot of really great stuff. Looking at your public library, if they're looking for homework help, like in Sudbury, we have a specific section of our library's website that is for homework help. If you're looking for, especially working online, you're looking for books, Hoopla and Cloud Library are often associated with, and there's a couple other ones. Overdrive is one of them. So finding out from your local library what free ebook services your library has is a really great thing, because it's a quick screen share if you're doing anything with books. StorylineOnline.net isn't on here, but it's also a great one we've used in our programs. It's where celebrities are reading stories when the copyright infringement was kind of paused during COVID. So they have stories, they have videos of celebrities reading books that are always great, because again, if you're online, it's a quick screen share. And then if you're doing any sort of math programming, Prodigy is well loved by many, many, many students. So the school system itself, so this is where we're going to get into some of that kind of alphabet soup that comes with the special education world. So as special education consists primarily of instruction and assessment that are different than those provided to the general student. So it takes two forms: accommodations and modifications. So you may not necessarily be working within the school system itself, but understanding what's happening in a classroom can then kind of help you with some of those students in programming. So accommodations doesn't change what a student learns, so they learn the curriculum at their grade level. It just changes the way they learn it. So for example, they may have a book on tape, or as opposed to reading a book, they may have audiobooks are huge right now, so that is an accommodation made for many students. They may have screen reading software that helps them read different things on their computers. They may have a computer to help them do their work. Modifications is when there are changes made to the subject or course to meet the student's needs. So that could be they're using different curriculum content. So they could take, if they're grade 6 students, but they're working at a grade 4 math level, their teacher is working through the grade 4 math curriculum with them. Or they could be working at the grade 6 level, but they're not doing all of the expectations. There's only certain expectations they have to meet. So it's reducing the amount that they need to do. It's changing the level of thinking skills required. So as you get higher up in the grades, they're expecting higher level thinking. You may have someone in grade 8 or 9 who is got the critical thinking level of a student in grade 3 or 4. And then again, raising or lowering grade level expectations. So some examples of accommodations in the classroom would be giving them sentence starters if they're writing a story, giving them extra time, there's structure strips, you're chunking information for them, so you're only giving them little pieces at a time to allow them to process that. If they're doing a research assignment, the teacher may give them a specific website to go to for research. So they're not just going through Google and getting lost and confused on all of the different search results that you can get. And they use different methods to show their learning. So instead of an oral presentation, they may just be reading what they've written for their research or something like that. Whereas the expectation may be the other students in the class are memorizing and presenting. So modifications, there's less or is easier information to learn. There's shorter or easier assignments. Less material is tested, so their tests are often either shorter or they're given more time if they're doing the same amount of, if they're doing the same test as their peers. And there's often alternative assessments, and that's determined by the teacher and the parents. So the IPRC, the alphabet soup. The IPRC is the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee. So this is the process by which a student is identified as exceptional and becomes entitled, legally entitled to special education programming and services. So before or while they're going through this process and waiting for testing, because testing can sometimes, especially with the wait lists, they're quite long and it can sometimes take years unless parents have the resources to get private testing. They can still receive help through an IEP, so that they're not falling further and further behind while they're on a waiting list. The IPRC itself may be delayed until they get that testing, but they can still have an IEP to help them. So the IEP is the Individualized Education Plan. It's a written plan. It is kind of reviewed and gone over every year to update and change as things change with a child, because they don't stay stagnant. It's to help parents understand what their child needs to be successful at school. It helps set goals for the child's learning, and it outlines the steps to get to those goals. So the school has to create a plan, an IEP, if they've been identified through the review committee. They may create an IEP if a child hasn't been formally identified. So maybe they've started the paperwork, like I said, they're on a waiting list. They can get that IEP to get them the help right away before the actual identification process goes through. So this is just the steps that are to develop an IEP. It does take time. It gets shorter as the years go on, because then you're just updating and kind of readapting a few things. A problem is identified by parents or teacher. The paperwork goes through, they identify the members of the IPRC, which is usually an administrator, special education teacher, classroom teacher, parents. Depending on the age of the child, they're sometimes involved in the process. A lot of parents, especially around grade 6-ish, start to get their kids involved so that they can learn to advocate for themselves in the classroom and in life, in other programs that they're involved in. So they can kind of say, this is what I need to be successful, and they can learn to do that. They gather all the information. Parents are consulted as the plan gets put together. They complete it. The principal approves the plan. It is signed by the parents. Parents do have the legal right to take it home and go over it. They have 30 days to sign it. They also have the right to have an advocate with them. So if parents are really nervous and unsure of the process, they can often reach out to a local learning disabilities association, and they often will walk parents through that process, because when you've never been through it, it can kind of be overwhelming. And that is it. Any questions? I will go to the chat here and see some questions. Yes, Giselle, not all deaf and hard of hearing can read lips. It does come with practice, but there are some students who they require that, that visual. Yes, ASL, having an interpreter in the classroom is also great, or if the teacher knows ASL, that's another great tip. But again, those are the services that would be put in place, especially in a classroom, with the IEP. Any other questions, concerns, comments?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, Stacy, for your presentation. Every time I hear you talk about